As we near the end of our discussions here on the second part of American history, we come to the last couple of decades before the present, and we're going to be dealing with, start talking about here the 1970s, the 1980s, the 1990s, and the 2000s as a series of topics going forward. And so we're going to have a lot of political discussions, we're going to have a lot of economic discussions, a lot of social discussions, some military activities. There's going to be a lot going on in a lot of different places with this one. So when we start dealing with this, we're going to have Richard Milhous Nixon is going to be President of the United States. And as he's coming in following the wake of the Johnson administration, in a lot of ways, he's going to look to be undoing much of the Great Society and spending programs, but he's not really interested in ending them altogether. Many of them he's not going to end. Many of them do not expand, but we are going to get a couple of new ones. We're going to get the Environmental Protection Agency, we're going to get the OSHA, the Occupational Safety Administration, and so. But the biggest problem that you're going to see facing Nixon domestically is not going to be debates necessarily over Great Society programs, but the actual economy itself. And that is going to be an ever-increasing problem throughout the latter days of the Nixon administration. And this is a problem that we call stagflation. Normally what happens here is inflation happens when there's too much money being pumped into the economy by a government through various kind of methods. But stagnation is where the economy slows down. Usually what happens in a normal business cycle is one or the other, but not both at the same time. This is going to be the case where, in fact, unemployment is going to go up, so you're going to get the stagnation in the economy, but prices are also going up. Normally those two things don't happen together. Well, looking back on this, we know why this is taking place, and that is you've got a great deal of increased governmental spending. One, on the Vietnam War, two, on a number of these major government domestic programs, and you also couple this with limited internal growth, and that's going to tag team together to create this problem. Nixon is never going to be able to really solve this, and none of his two immediate successors, Gerald Ford or Jimmy Carter, are going to be able to either, because they're all sort of applying different governmental fixes, trying to figure out, how government can best fix this problem. It's not going to be until the 1980s when finally somebody comes in and says, okay, I think the government is the problem. Let's remove that it's finally going to go away, right? Now, in terms of foreign policy, Nixon is going to try to aggressively end the Vietnam War with a victory. When he fails to do that, he eventually starts Vietnamizing the conflict, training the Vietnamese to sort of fight their own battle, and then withdrawing U.S. forces from this as well. So there's Richard Nixon. He's worried about, I don't know, a lot of stuff. He could be ordering a pizza for all I know. So this is him with this. I've got a little animated GIF file on the website for you to look up if you want to explain in supply and demand terms how stagflation works, and it goes to this various kind of things. The problem with dealing with macroeconomics with a lot of students is it sort of makes them go cross-eyed as you follow it. But I encourage you to look at it, and it'll give you a good idea of why things are happening here in the 1970s with stagflation the way that they were. The other major foreign policy front that the Nixon administration is going to put forward, and this is going to be the case for about 10 years, is going to be détente, right? Which is a French term for sort of a cooling off of heated positions. And this is going to be directly in the wake of the Vietnam War. Nixon, with his first as National Security Advisor and then eventually Secretary of State Henry Kissinger, is going to be looking at this and saying, okay, we really didn't do so well in the Vietnam War. Why were we even fighting this? I mean, who cares if the rice paddies of Vietnam are communist rice paddies? And so what we're going to see is they go towards a policy that Kissinger would call realpolitik, which is a German term, realistic politics, which is, let's take a realistic approach to the Cold War instead of just a rigid, fixed ideology that, well, communism is bad, and so we have to fight it, everywhere. Instead, we got to deal with the fact that a tiny little country like Vietnam really probably shouldn't matter to us a whole lot. But we do have to deal with the fact that China is a big country, and we really didn't have much of a relationship with them because they were communists. Russia is a big country, and yeah, on the one hand, we disagree about what to do with the world. Should it be capitalist? Should it be communist? But we have to deal with the fact that they're out there, and we need to talk to them on a little bit more of an even playing field. So Nixon is going to do this to try to ease these Cold War tensions. First of all, Nixon is going to visit China, and he's going to open up trade relations between China and the United States. And this, of course, is going to be a major economic generator for both countries, as you can't go to the store today without finding tons of made in China stuff. And so this is going to be all a product of the Nixon administration. But he's also going to go to Moscow. and broker limits on nuclear weapons between the Russians and the United States. They say, hey, if we've got enough nukes to kill each other 10 times over, maybe we dial it back to where 5 times over, right? And so we're going to see that throughout the later part of the 1970s, President Carter would continue these limits as they went on. Now, on the one hand, détente is also a subtle little way to try to worm in between China and the Soviet Union. Because you look at it and say, well, wait a minute, China's communist, Soviet Union's communist, they should be, buddy-buddy. The problem is there's a strong debate between which brand of communism is going to be better. And the United States is really going to seek to come in and say, hey, one of you guys should be friends with us. In this case, it's going to be China. But a lot of people here, as I mentioned, felt that the inflexibility towards communism had led to the Vietnam debacle. And so let's try to avoid that as well. So this is Nixon. He's going to meet Chairman Mao here and open up relations with them. And the idea being that, you couldn't just have anybody say that being friends with communists was all right. You had to pick some guy that was very serious about being anti-communist, and Nixon fit the bill. He was a pretty strong Cold War guy, and so if Nixon said we could be friends with the Chinese, well, okay, we'll listen with this. So there's Richard Nixon. He's up on the Great Wall of China. He's getting the tour of the country. Here he is pretending to like Chinese food, and this is him visiting the Soviets in Moscow as they begin a series of talks about nuclear arms limitations. But we can't talk about Richard Nixon without talking about Watergate, this thing that would scar sort of the American psyche for quite a long time. During Nixon's re-election campaign here in 1972, several of his staffers that are going to engage in a break-in of the Democratic National Convention's headquarters at the Watergate Hotel in Washington, D.C. And these guys are there to steal documents. They're going to tap the Democrats' phone. They're there, never really know for sure totally what they were doing there. But the guys are caught, but it's pretty close to the election, and so it doesn't really have a lot of time to have any kind of traction on the election itself. Nixon is going to win re-election relatively easily. But questions continue to stir about how high up in the administration people knew about the break-in. Right? 2 reporters at the Washington Post, and then eventually being kind of egged on by a lot of sources, members of Congress, they began investigating this, and they're saying, well, who knew what? What was going on with this? And they discovered pretty quickly that many high-ranking members of Nixon's staff were involved. And they're interviewing all these people, and they kind of run into a number of stone walls, people not willing to give them answers, until finally they bring in one of these young staffers who doesn't want to spend the rest of his life in jail for this kind of thing. And he says, look, I'm telling you the truth. I didn't have anything to do with this. Look, there's all these tapes that Nixon has, tape recording machines all throughout the White House. He's taping these conversations. The tapes will prove that I'm innocent. And they're, what? There are tapes? There are tapes of all these conversations? And so this, of course, is going to send Congress scurrying after these tapes. Nixon, of course, says, no, I've got executive privilege. These are my tapes, you can't have them. And so the Supreme Court eventually is going to step in and be the referee in this tussle between the 2 branches of the federal government. They're going to say, okay, this could be evidence of a crime, and so, sorry, Nixon, you're going to have to hand over the tapes. When he does, the tapes are pretty condemning of Nixon. It does prove that Nixon did not order the break-in in the first place, but it does say that he ordered the cover-up, which is not legal. This is obstruction of justice. And so he is forced to resign the presidency in disgrace. And so these are some scenes here from the congressional investigation. He's asking, what did the president know, and when did he know it? And that's, of course, the famous kind of scene that continues to get reenacted every time Congress now has questions for an administration of whether or not the president is a bad person or not. And so this is Nixon, and there he is on TV reading his resignation to the nation. And there he is trying to put on a happy face as he boards Marine One helicopter and to helicopter off into obscurity. So Gerald Ford is going to take over briefly for a couple of years. He will run, but in 1976, this Watergate scandal is really going to be a punch to the gut to the Republican Party. And this is going to open the door to a Democrat, really any Democrat, to win the White House in 1976. The chair of the Democratic National Committee joked that they could run an aardvark and win. They don't run an aardvark, but they do find a Georgia peanut farmer, the former governor of Georgia named Jimmy Carter, to run. And he, of course, would win as a result of that. Now, Carter was pretty affable. He was a pretty friendly guy. And he is going to continue these détente policies, much less confrontational approach to the USSR, to the Cold War as well. But this is an important little lesson to learn in that, on the one hand, Carter is sending out, hey, let's be friends and let's not blow each other up. That's the message that President Carter is trying to send. The message that the Soviets receive is the United States is weak, and the only reason they're trying to be friends with us now is because they know that we could take them. And so they are going to start taking very aggressive stances, not only amongst themselves, but we're also going to see a lot of other anti-American forces are going to take aggressive stances as well. They're going to invade Afghanistan in an attempt to push their Soviet empire closer and closer to warm water ports in the Indian Ocean. Iranian rebels, fundamentalist Islamists, are going to view the Carter administration much the same way, and they're in a revolution against their U.S.-backed government. They're going to seize the United States embassy and a number of American citizens and refuse to return them. On the domestic front, you're going to see that stagflation continues to get worse under Carter, and all these government fixes to try to solve the problem really don't go anywhere. And then you couple that with a very crippling gasoline shortage and rising energy costs to a lot of Americans. It's the kind of situation, you know, where people, they go to the gas station, not only is the gas price really high, but in many cases, okay, we're out, we don't have any. Well, I'll give you, you know, 20 bucks a gallon. No, you don't understand, we're out, we don't have it, okay? Carter proposes government intervention with all these things, but these attempts are going to fail pretty badly. So this is Jimmy Carter. This is an official photograph of him as the President of the United States. A lot of people like to make fun of Jimmy Carter and his sort of big smile with this one. These are the Americans being hauled off as hostages by these Iranians on TV. These are the people lined up outside gas stations here in the late 1970s to try to get gas in their cars during the gas shortage. So this is what you'd see on TV. So in 1980, Jimmy Carter is going to run for re-election, and he's going to get thumped pretty badly by Ronald Reagan. Reagan is going to be one of these watershed events in American history, and he's going to greatly change sort of America's direction vis-a-vis its relationship to government. He wins with what we would come to be called sort of conservatism, right, in terms of domestic policy, but also in terms of foreign policy. He really wants to get rid of détente, and he says we shouldn't be pals with the Soviets. We need to beat these guys. So it's a much more sort of Truman-esque policy of confrontationalism towards the Soviet Union. Now, domestically, this conservative approach is based on the conclusion that government has become a barrier to success, that there isn't a right way for the government to come in and fix people's problems because the government creates problems. So to this end, he proposes a series of specific policies such as decreased taxation, loosened government regulation over business, more free trade around the world, decreased government spending with the exception of military spending. And basically, the overall goal is to reduce the role of government in people's lives and let them spend their own money, let them make their own businesses, let them create their own awesome inventions, whatever, and then the economy will revive in this way, right? We're also going to see that there's a sort of a social component to this, and that is stressing family values, traditional mores in society, opposing abortion, divorce, drug use, children born out of wedlock, etc. What's interestingly enough is Ronald Reagan, despite promoting all of these kind of things, is the first president to have been divorced and then been elected president. So there you go. This is Ronald Reagan. He also, as you can tell from the photograph, he's the oldest person we've ever had serve as president of the United States. This is sometimes taken to be a somewhat controversial kind of thing. This is the Laffer curve. The idea being that if the government takes 0% of the people's money in taxes, then it will receive zero revenue, which of course makes sense. And the other end of the curve is that if the government says, okay, we're going to take every single penny that you earn, well, nobody would get a job because there's no point in making money if the government's going to take it all, so they'd take zero revenue that way. And then at some point, increasing revenue would get to a certain point, and then eventually people would stop, they would stop taking overtime, they would stop inventing new things, because if the government's going to take like 90 to 95% of what you make, maybe it's not going to be a good idea to get more work. So this is going to be the guiding principle that Reagan is going to go off of, and this is going to be what's going to form the foundation of his tax policy. There's a little fun here. The left lane ends and the merge right is going to take place as a result of this. So in terms of Ronald Reagan and his relationship to the Cold War, in one speech he refers to the Soviet Union as the evil empire, and it flips everybody out because, oh, the bombs are going to start falling in 5 minutes, right? But he does begin a very large U.S. weapons buildup. Many of the, like a stealth fighter program that Jimmy Carter had canceled, a number of other weapon systems that Carter had either not approved or canceled, he is going to spend a lot of money on. The United States is going to get a new main fighter plane, they're going to get a new main battle tank. A lot of weapon systems, a lot of military spending is going to come online as a result of that. And so the U.S. military is going to mushroom under Ronald Reagan. And he is going to directly challenge the Soviet Union diplomatically. He's going to go to Berlin, he's going to stand in front of the Berlin Wall, and he's going to demand that the Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev to tear down this wall. Right? He's also going to begin building a weapons system in space. And now the interesting thing about this is that it was called the Strategic Defense Initiative, and it was nicknamed Star Wars due to the popular series of films from the late 70s and the early 80s. And the idea was you shoot down Soviet missiles from space using lasers, right, and a number of other pieces of technology. The cool thing was basically it wasn't real. It got the Russians into spending ways to counterbalance it. Supposedly, still today, we're working on bits of it, but I mean, it was nowhere near what we said we were spending on it. Right? Now, a lot of people were afraid that Reagan is going to start a war. He's just going to start a war. I mean, remember there were like specials on TV about how the United States was just going to blow the world up because this crazy California cowboy, who used to be an actor, is just going to destroy planet Earth in World War III. But Reagan's calculation was that the Soviets are going to go broke trying to keep up with the United States. And it turns out that he would be right. So there's Ronald Reagan. He's at the Berlin Wall, the Brandenburg Gate, and he's challenging Mikhail Gorbachev to tear down this wall. This is a diagram of the Star Wars system, SDI, and how it was supposed to work. And of course, this was all so much poppycock. But the Russians bought it, and they started spending money on how to counteract this supposed defense system for the United States. And so you start to see that Reagan's foreign policy begins to bear fruit as early as 1989. You're going to see that the Soviets are unable to quell the growing anti-communist movements in their Eastern European, the Soviet, Eastern Bloc nations. Gorbachev is forced to leave to allow them to leave this communist orbit. And in Germany, you'll see, for example, the East German communists are going to allow the Berlin Wall to come down in several places. The East Berliners, they stream into West Berlin, and they see that capitalism isn't a system of slavery, that it isn't what they've been told about it, that in fact the grocery stores are full of food, that the stores are full of stuff, and that people drive around in cars, and it's not this horrible existence. And when they return then to their homes in East Berlin, they demand that communism go away. And so by the end of the year, Eastern Europe is going to basically pull down the communist system, and the Soviet Union really can only stand by and watch as a result of that. This is the Polish Solidarity movement led by Lech Walesa here in the 1980s. This is Riga, Latvia, in 1989, as the Baltic states were actually the first to break from Soviet orbit. This is Prague in Czechoslovakia in 1989, where the people take to the streets and demand an end to communist rule. East Berlin, 1989, where of course the Berlin Wall is going to come down, and they're going to stream into the West. And in what proves to be kind of a presage of the post-Cold War world, we're going to see that local problems, without the pressure of trying to conform to this U.S. versus Soviet Union paradigm, are going to start flaring up. All right. And in August of 1990, Iraqi dictator Saddam Hussein is going to order his forces to invade Kuwait. Kuwait is this tiny little postage stamp-sized country, but at that point represented something like 60% of the oil imports to the United States. He's also going to attempt to attack Saudi Arabia, but U.S. forces managed to get into Saudi Arabia and defend Saudi Arabia from his forces. Because Hussein's goal here is pretty obvious. He wants to control the world's oil supply and make everybody do what he says. And if they don't do what he says, then they don't get any more oil. You don't drive around in your cars. And while it seems kind of silly to fight over oil, this is exactly what Saddam Hussein wanted people to do. You got to buy oil from me, and you got to take it or leave it. So the United States is going to gather a very large coalition of nations. First, the goal here in Operation Desert Shield is to defend Saudi Arabia from being attacked again by Hussein's forces. And then they are going to convert over to an offensive posture, Operation Desert Storm, and they're going to threaten Iraq with invasion unless he gets his army out of Kuwait. And so this is this whole region. This is Iraq on the map today. It's about the size of the state of Texas, and then there's this tiny little corner down here. This is where Kuwait is, and of course Saudi Arabia is here as well. So there's Saddam Hussein, and this is him leading his Republican Guard, ordering his Republican Guard forces into Kuwait as a result of that. So Hussein refuses to meet the United States/United Nations ultimatum, and so President George Bush, he's going to order a massive invasion of Iraq on a number of fronts. Well, A lot of people, including a lot of the Russians who had been selling a lot of equipment to the Iraqis, thought, well, this is going to be a long, protracted war. The United States is going to, the United States will win, but it's going to take forever. It turns out that this takes like 4 days of fighting. The United States demolishes the Iraqi army and air force, and they advance towards Baghdad, and they're actually crushing these forces left and right. The United States, however, calls off the advance because they say that their mandate from the United Nations was to liberate the country of Kuwait, not to topple Saddam Hussein's government in Iraq. You're also going to see that the United States is becoming increasingly conscious of the ethnic and religious differences that exist in the Middle East, and that they're worried about an alliance of the co-religionists between Iraqi and Iranian Muslims in the wake of an anti-Saddam revolution. So they're worried about an Iran-Iraq superstate full of possibly Muslim terrorists coming after them if they don't allow Saddam Hussein to remain in power. But what's becoming obvious here, because the Russians play no role, the Soviet Union here in 1990 and early 1991, they play no role in what's going on in the Persian Gulf War. So you've got a big, blow-up that happens, and the Russians aren't really involved, right? When you look at what's going on with a lot of the fighting throughout these decades, starting in the 1950s, the Korean War, yeah, it was the United States versus North Korea and China, but really, Russia was behind all of this. They were supplying these guys. They definitely had somebody that they wanted to win because, it's furthering the cause of communism. The same is true for the Vietnam War. It's the United States versus North Vietnam, but China and Russia really, they want to see North Vietnam win. They're supplying them, and so that fits that paradigm. The same is true here in Afghanistan, where you get the Mujahideen, but the United States is supplying these guys, and they want to make sure that they fight off the Soviet Union. This is one of these conflicts that takes place, and it really doesn't fit. This has to do with oil and Islam and dictators, and nobody's a communist in any of this. And so it's becoming increasingly apparent that the United States is becoming, if not already, is the world's only superpower. So these are American tanks in the desert of the Middle East in the Persian Gulf War. These are knocked out Russian-made T-72s that were in service that had been purchased by the Iraqis of this. And so by August of 1991, really the USSR was on life support. It was kind of on its last leg. And the economy was really starting to fall apart because nobody worked hard. Nobody did anything. Nobody invented, because everybody makes the same amount of money. The only way that you get ahead in society is by scamming the government. And what you're going to see is Mikhail Gorbachev's government had begun experimenting with giving a few new freedoms to these people under a plan called Perestroika. But instead of, okay, we got a few extra freedoms, now we can kind of back off from demanding change. In fact, all it had done was made the Russians hungry for more freedoms. They began agitating against their government. Well, not everybody is happy that Gorbachev is this friendly, open, kind of communist. A lot of these people wanted to go back to the old Stalinist ways of, hey, you tell the people what to do, and if they don't do it, you shoot them. So what's going to happen here is these guys are going to grab Gorbachev while he's on vacation in the southern part of Russia. He's at a beach house in the Crimea, and they haul him off, and they're going to set up a new government. Well, that then means that these people of the USSR, first they're going to rally around Gorbachev, they're going to take to the streets, and they begin protesting this. But as they start protesting the fact that they want Gorbachev to come back, then they realize that, well, really what we want is communism to go away. And so it becomes very, very quickly a massive anti-communist protest. The tipping point comes when the army is ordered to go in and break up these protests, and simply they refuse. In one case, you've got the fact that the army hadn't been paid, according to some accounts, for several months, but also, too, the army just kind of agreed with these people that communism needed to go away. And so the Soviet Union simply ceased to exist. It just collapsed in on itself, and the United States is going to win the Cold War here in August of 1991. So here's some civilians in Moscow. They're climbing on top of these Russian tanks because they've been abandoned by their crews, and that's what you would see on TV. Well, Reagan's successor, George H.W. Bush, is going to get himself elected here in 1988. But really, despite winning the Persian Gulf War, we're going to see a recession, and a third-party candidate in Ross Perot is going to throw everything into a tizzy in the 1992 presidential election. And that's going to lead to the Democrat, Bill Clinton, winding up in charge. And he's really going to dominate, for the most part, 1990s politics. Now, the first 2 years of his administration, he's going to have a Democrat president, and he's going to have a Democratic Congress, and so he can get a lot done. He goes pretty hard to the left his first couple of years. National health care is going to be one of these plans that he is going to put forward, and his party, as a result of this, is going to lose control of Congress to much more conservative Republicans for the first time really since the 1950s. Well, Bill Clinton kind of reads the stitches on the fastball and says, oh, okay, well, conservatism hasn't gone away just because I won an election. And he says, I'm going to become a much more moderate, conservative kind of guy. And when you look at the things that Bill Clinton sort of champions, he is going to do things that basically make him look sort of like a moderate Republican. He's going to balance the budget, he's going to cut welfare spending, he's going to deregulate major parts of the economy. Now, generally speaking, one of the areas that Bill Clinton gets a lot of criticism here is the fact that he sought negotiation, and the ever-mounting terrorist attacks in the late 1990s, he treated more as law enforcement issues, that these were bad people that were doing bad things and they needed to be, investigated and arrested and thrown in jail, rather than looking at this as, hey, these people represent a bigger movement of people that want to come and hurt us, and maybe we should treat it as a foreign policy issue rather than a law enforcement issue. For example, on at least a couple of occasions, he has the opportunity to just grab Osama bin Laden before the 9/11 terrorist attacks, and he says, no, we don't want to cause a ruckus. We don't want to cause problems with different nations, and so he sort of passes on that. However, when you look at domestically, the economy is going to explode thanks to the internet and a number of other technological changes, biomedicine and a bunch of other things, globalized policies of trade thanks to the fall of the Soviet Union, more places for the United States businesses to trade with, and so we're going to see just a massive mushrooming of the U.S. Economy as a result of that. Now, the low point of his presidency undoubtedly is going to come from the fact that Bill Clinton apparently had a problem with ladies, in that he liked them too much and too often. If you look throughout his career as a public figure, first I think he was like Attorney General of Arkansas, and then mentioned the Governor of Arkansas, and then President of the United States. There are a lot of women that said that he did a lot of things with them that he shouldn't have. So one of these women is trying to bring Bill Clinton up on these sexual harassment charges, and then the people that are investigating him say, well, we've also heard that you've had this relationship with one of your White House staffers, a woman named Monica Lewinsky, and so he's giving testimony, nope, there is no relationship, we're not doing any of that kind of stuff. But then later on it turns out that, yeah, they did. Okay, so basically you've got a President of the United States who goes before a grand jury and lies. Now, if this is just a regular citizen, all right, and you get caught lying to a court, you get like 20 years in jail because you're not allowed to do this. But the president, well, now you've got this battle between the judicial branch and the executive branch, and it gets a little bit more complicated with this. And so basically what's going to happen here is the House of Representatives is going to impeach Bill Clinton for obstruction of justice and a couple of other charges, right? However, once the trial goes to the Senate does not get the supermajority that it needs to convict him. So Bill Clinton is only the second president ever to be impeached. But just like we saw with the first, we have yet to actually kick a president out of office as a result of this. So there's Bill Clinton. This is his official 1993 photograph of him as President of the United States. And this is, of course, one of the guys that he's going to deal with, and his successor, George W. Bush, is going to have to deal with it. That's Osama bin Laden. The 9/11, the 2001 terrorist attacks, are actually the second attempt by Al-Qaeda to knock down the World Trade Center buildings in New York. The first of these was in 1993. They parked a truck that was full of bombs in one of the little parking areas, and they tried to blow up the one so it would fall into the other. It didn't work, but that was the idea here in 1993. But ever increasingly throughout the 1990s, U.S. targets would come under attack by terrorists. These are what's left of the Khobar Towers, U.S. Embassy in East Africa, and this is the USS Cole that was attacked by a bomb in a boat here in 2000, right before Bill Clinton left office. And so there's a lot of this going on. And there you can see some scenes of the scandal. This is Monica Lewinsky testifying. This is Bill Clinton in August of 1998, forcing to, anyway. So less said about that, the better. When you look at socioeconomics, though, and I mentioned globalization with this, we're going to see that a great deal of free trade in the 1990s is going to become a reality. Now, the United States, really even since the 1700s, has always had something of a global presence, but it never really accelerated quite to the point like you'll see it in the 1990s. And one of the early visions of the League of Nations following the First World War was that if we trade with each other, we won't fight with each other. And so this idea of free trade, where basically all these barriers, tariffs, taxes, government regulations on trade between different nations would go away. They'd either be lower or non-existent, is finally going to come to a reality. One, thanks to the end of the Cold War. You no longer have the United States and the Soviet Union sort of vying for dominance of their global views of the future, because the Soviet Union is going to go away. China, of course, had evolved into a different form of communism, where it's sort of communism politically, but it's really not communism economically, right? And so all of these places are now going to be open to U.S. markets, and U.S. markets are going to be open to them. So all of this is going to take place in the same time that a great deal of communication technology is going to allow for a much more efficient flow of people, products, services. It was not uncommon to be able to get a job in one country where you're actually working in another country, thanks to this digital flow of information, right? And a lot of these industrialized nations, ever increasingly this idea of nationalism, had given way to a regionalist multinational cooperation. You'll see, for example, the Eurozone, Europe, had begun to adopt this idea that, well, yeah, we've got our own national differences, but really we need to cooperate with each other economically, unlike a way that had existed 100 years before. And so by 2000, you could definitely say that the world's economy had become globalized. And so this is globalization. Actually, it's just the Earth rotating in a little animated image. But it was cool, and I found it on the internet, so I put it in the slideshow. In 2000, you've got what looks like a pretty straightforward political matchup. You've got an extremely successful, at least domestically, administration in the Bill Clinton years, and while he is term limited after his re-election in 1996, you figure, well, Democrats have the inside track. And his sitting vice president, Al Gore, is running, and so he'd be able to say, hey, we'll be able to take the same kind of level of peace and prosperity, and we'll be able to run with that some more. And so he's definitely going to garner a lot of support with this. But you do have an opponent, President Bush's son, then Texas Governor George W. Bush, running as his opponent. But what we're going to see is, some flaws in the candidates themselves. You've got Al Gore, who unfortunately was born apparently without a personality, and George W. Bush, who was born apparently without the ability to speak in complete sentences. So you've got a weird kind of campaign that goes forward, and in the last days of the campaign, you'll see that the polls look like, oh, well, it's a dead heat, could be anybody. It could be a really, really close election. And so despite the prosperity of the 1990s, Gore's never going to be able to really capitalize on that a whole lot. And actually what you're going to see here is that Gore is going to lose the Electoral College count despite winning the popular vote. And you do have a very controversial election here with the Florida votes being contested. Long story short, Bush is going to win, but without a great deal of a popular mandate going forward here in 2000. Well, he doesn't really allow that to deter him. He sort of just assumes that he gets to go forward with his agenda, and he's going to go on a moderately conservative agenda, especially initially, of cutting taxes, reducing regulations. However, as his administration went on, he was not afraid of big spending. We're going to see that he's going to increase some programs, funding greatly in terms of education with things like No Child Left Behind, Medicare prescription drug funding, and this is going to incur a pretty large deficit by the end of his administration. So much so that during the last 2 years of his administration, he's going to have to deal with a Democrat Congress. His party is actually going to lose control of Congress as a result of their big spending ways following their leader, the President of the United States. But really, you've got to be honest that the defining moment of his presidency is going to be his response to the major event, and that's going to come 9 months in on September 11th, 2001, when terrorists are going to destroy the World Trade Center in New York and also blow up a major part of the Pentagon near Washington, D.C. Bush is going to have a different reaction to terrorism than his predecessor, Bill Clinton. Bill Clinton had regarded this as kind of a law enforcement issue, maybe an international law enforcement issue, but still, it was a law enforcement thing. Bush says, no, this is a foreign policy thing, that, yeah, these people don't have another country that they're attacking us from, but this is a war. People have waged, or have declared war on us, and now we need to fight them in a war wherever it goes. And so basically, using this doctrine that sometimes we refer to as the Bush Doctrine, meaning that if you're going to harbor these terrorists, we're going to treat you the same as we treat the terrorists themselves. The United States thus is going to invade Afghanistan, which had been the base of operations for Osama bin Laden And we're also going to see that they're going to then plant a semi-democratic government, which is still somewhat shaky in the region. But we're also going to see that the Iraqis apparently had either been somewhat involved or threatening to get involved with potential from weapons of mass destruction in the second Gulf War, Operation Iraqi Freedom, and they're going to invade Iraq and remove the dictator Saddam Hussein as a result of that. So here you can see some scenes here of the Florida recount in 2000, which, wasn't that a whole lot of fun. These are some scenes of the terrorist attack here on 9/11 with the World Trade Center exploding, and eventually they would collapse down. 3,000 Americans, or almost 3,000 Americans, would die that day. And then this is what you're going to see. A lot of American troops in the Middle East rooting out terrorists, fighting them on a number of fronts as a result of that. Until we get close to the end of the decade, though, we're going to see a pretty sharp turn against the Republicans as a result of their sort of big spending ways. In 2009, we're going to see the election of a really liberal president, Barack Obama, the first African-American president in U.S. history. But conservatives don't go away. They managed to get their own party elected in a big sort of sweep in 2010 to control the House of Representatives. And so you've got divided government and a lot of gridlock that takes place with these very different visions for America as a result of that.